I don't mind saying, being totally frank, I do personally struggle to get my head around this. When I think about One World Trade Center extending sideways for 170 kilometers, I struggle to fathom that. But then, as I said earlier, I think people before us would have struggled to fathom some of the things we see and do today. So hopefully it's a case of that.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Be Sustainable, UCEM's podcast, today focusing on digital transformation in the built environment. We have two guests with us today. Marc Fleming, he's a program leader for the BSc Architectural Design Technology at UCEM and a Chartered Architectural Technologist. He has extensive experience in industry, secondary, further and higher education, teaching and management, as well as running his own consultancy practice. Additionally, Marc is a member of the Institute of Innovation and Knowledge Exchange. He's actively involved in a range of working groups and networks that support the transformation of industry and skills and training opportunities. Also with us today, we have Fred Mills. Fred is an award-winning entrepreneur and YouTuber. He's a founder of B1M, the world's largest and most subscribed to video channel for construction, with over 3 million subscribers. He recently launched Tomorrow's Build, which is focused on shaping the future of construction. Fred has also been awarded an honorary master's degree by UCEM for his outstanding and inspiring contribution to the built environment sector. Fred, Marc, welcome both of you today. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to discuss the line in NEOM in Saudi Arabia from an architectural and an engineering point of view. And we're going to discuss, to a certain extent, the ethical, social and sustainable implications of building something like this. I'll start with Fred. Fred, you've spoken publicly about the line before, but to people who aren't familiar with it, what do you think of the linear city concept?
Oh, well, thanks for having us on, Mike. I really appreciate being here. It's great to be on a great podcast with yourself and Marc, and also to be talking about such a fantastically exciting and daringly ambitious project. So it's exciting to be here. I think the line is one of those things that it almost defies logic in a way when you first see it. And as a linear city, obviously the concept of linear cities has been around for some time, but this somewhat raises the bar and turns the volume up to 100. It's a very, very impressive project proposition. For those of you listening that aren't familiar with the line, it is a 500 metre tall, 200 metre wide linear city that will stretch for 170 kilometres across the desert. Now, just saying those numbers, describing those words, it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary project idea. The whole thing's mirrored, so it will go across the desert as an enormous mirror. And it's quite hard, I think, when you look at the renders and when you look at the design renders, to try and sort of fathom what this is and what it looks like and imagine what it would be like against something because it's sitting out in the middle of the desert. But 500 meters tall is about the same height as One World Trade Center in New York. So that's the tallest building in New York City, the tallest building in the USA. What we're talking about is that building, but 200 meters wide and then extending sideways for 170 kilometers. It is an extraordinarily bold and ambitious project. And like I said, it challenges, I think, most conventional thinking around urban planning and forces the architecture and construction and engineering sectors to step up to the plate and explore how we could build something like this.
Yeah, I still can't get used to those numbers. 170 kilometres long and 500 metres. I really struggle with it. Marc, from your point of view, where's the idea of linear cities come from a design and an architectural perspective?
So linear cities themselves are not a new phenomenon. They're typically perceived to be the epitome of good urban planning in terms of allowing growth to manifest itself around transportation networks. However, we look in the past at examples of cities like Volgograd in Russia and more recently Brasilia, which was heralded as a modernist utopia, whereby a blank canvas, and it was a symbol of Brazil saying to the world, they're a much more modern country than what the perception was. And, what part of the drive was to free Brazil of colonial legacy, with its previous capital city, Rio de Janeiro. So by creating Brasilia, what the Brazilian government wanted to was to put Brazil on the map, as an economic powerhouse. But their colonial legacy had was behind them. However, initially, the pilot plan area in Brasilia was a fantastic concept. Again, going back to the principles of linear cities, transportation networks. However, over time, linear cities led to a lot of issues with regards to mobility, social cohesion, and urban sprawl. So the patterns that we learn over time are that cities, cultures, habits all change, and the line is obviously as Fred alluded to, it's a concept times 100, in terms of getting the infrastructure right at the first time of asking, because the linear city concept and obviously the line in itself, is predicated on there being no urban sprawl, being good social cohesion. So learning the lessons from the past is an opportunity to embed both in the design and the building phase, and indeed the operational phase of the line itself.
Interesting stuff. And so, Fred, given the history of this and the sort of thing that Mark's just been talking about, why now? Why all of a sudden is the line appearing as a very high-profile concept?
It's a good question. I think there's a few different reasons for it. There's a few converging factors that I think have brought the line into fruition right now. One, I think the main one, is Saudi Arabia's desire to diversify its economy. It's created this public investment fund, the PIF, which is a state investment fund. It's designed to invest in projects that will help diversify the country's economy away from oil, which is a large chunk of the country's economy, to other industries, other sectors. So partly tourism, but also a lot of the investment that comes through tourism as well, and the investment that comes with being a more attractive hub, basically, in the middle of the world. Dubai did a very similar thing. We might remember the kind of the tranche of mega projects that came out of Dubai. We had the world's tallest building, we had the Palm Islands, we had the world map, we had the world's deepest pool, world's tallest cantilever, world's biggest, tallest, longest, you name it, they built it. And that felt a bit, there's quite a lot of inertia around Dubai at the time. But what they've done there is really diversify their economy away from just oil to tourism, and they've driven a lot more investment in that area. That's very much what Saudi Arabia are doing here. Now, you don't do that by creating a very mediocre, straightforward city. What you do is get yourself in the headlines, to draw attention, attract investments, and get people talking about you. And that's very much what they've done with the line. I think that's why the line is the shape it is and why it's as dramatic as it is, to catch the headlines and to get people talking, but also to set a bar for the construction industry, to help stretch people about what good cities could look like. I think the other reason it's come to fruition right now, or the reason it's been proposed right now, is around sustainability. There is a real challenge facing this industry right now about how we build and operate our built environment in a more sustainable way. It accounts for 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So understanding what we can do to improve our cities, to urban plan in a better way and build in a more sustainable way is incredibly important. I'm sure Mark will touch on this, but at the core of the line's philosophy is this concept of the 15-minute city. So the idea that you can come out of your front door and everything you need is within a 5 to 15-minute walk or bike ride from your house. So that's your doctors, your school, your grocery store, the place where you work, your friends and family, your local recreation ground. All of that is in within walking distance, or 5 to 15 minutes walk or bike ride from where you live. Now, what we're saying at the line is it's the similar philosophy. It's this similar philosophy of a series of 15-minute cities connected across this huge linear stretch of construction. We're not saying that you have to go from one end of the line 170 kilometres to the other end to buy a loaf of bread. You wouldn't do that in London. You wouldn't do that in New York. You wouldn't decide to go to the other side of Tokyo just to buy a pint of milk. You'd do it locally. And that's very much the same thing here. So I think on the surface, it's easy to look at the line and see it as a very dramatic, bold, unsustainable, goodness me, what on earth were they thinking type proposal. But actually, when you dig into it, there is a lot of science, there's a lot of sustainability credentials and thinking that's gone into that. Making it happen, I think it's going to be a fantastic, exciting time to see how the industry gets stretched and how it responds to the challenge and the gauntlet that's been laid down by Saudi Arabia.
And that opens the next question. they've got the headlines, the timing might be right for this, but is it even possible?
I think it is possible, and I can hear people being triggered as I say that, because I know there are a lot of people out there who think this isn't possible, and many people have said many things online about why it isn't possible and why it won't ever work. I think it's easy to look at these things when they first get proposed and think they're not possible. But I think people thought the same about the Empire State Building. You know, when before the Empire State Building, when skyscrapers were being built 10, 20, 30 stories high, because we didn't have elevator engineering systems, we didn't have the advancements in steel material manufacturing to enable taller buildings, people thought a 100-story skyscraper would never be possible. Now, 100-story skyscrapers are the norm. You see them in many cities around the world. I mean, outside of construction, same thing. You look at aviation. If you described people in the Victorian era, accelerating people through the sky in a pressurized tube, 37,000 feet above the surface of the earth, with their luggage and serve them drinks on the way, people would have laughed at you. It's just out of question. But I think it's a similar thing here. Now, obviously, this is a very, very bold proposal. It goes way beyond anything mankind has built before. But what I'm always struck by in construction is that we make the impossible happen. You know, we've done that with all kinds of projects all around the world for centuries. Things that you think, how on earth do they build that? This is the industry that makes it happen. So, yes, it feels very bold. It feels very ambitious. And I think it's deliberately been set at a level that is above what mankind can achieve today. But that's kind of the idea. The idea is to stretch ourselves, to innovate, to develop new technologies, and to, as it were, raise the line and find a way to make this happen.
And I guess that's one major advantage of this project, if and when, is the innovation that it will drive out of necessity. But Mark, what's your view around the innovation in the field of design and architecture that this could bring?
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific opportunity for the sector to, collaborate with other sectors to look at and learn lessons in terms of how we can produce a building and produce a city, more importantly, that can achieve the needs of now, but of the future as well. And, the pursuit of innovative practice is something that is widely recognised that the sector needs in order to modernise. Generative design, going to the design concept even, generative design for the listeners who don't know what generative design is, it's effectively an automated design process that's predicated on goals and outputs. So the design process is effectively automated through a series of inputs and objectives. That could be, the average distance from home to the supermarket to buy a loaf of bread. It could be to restrict movement between a particular property and a particular district. So there's a range of factors that can be influenced. And what generative design does is it gives you a range of options, and the most optimized solution, and again, going back to the objectives, the most optimum solution could be based on cost. It could be based on, socio-economic factors that can, improve social cohesion. So generative design as a process is actually ripping up the rule book of urban planning by traditionally planning in 2 dimensions. But the line gives us an opportunity to do urban planning on a 3-dimensional scale. And that's something on this scale has not been done before. We can talk about 3-dimensional planning from the point of view of a building, but to plan a whole entire city in 3 dimensions based on multi-objective optimization is a fantastic opportunity for the sector to actually demonstrate how innovative practices at the design stage can lead to improvements both in the construction and during the asset's lifetime. So I think for the sector itself, it's a great opportunity to embrace innovation and innovative practices. But that's before we even start putting a spade in the ground. And I think this is the next challenge for us as a sector, is actually understanding the complexities of what we're proposing at the design stage and how that correlates with, good design practice, good, strong, cohesive building practices that are going to make the structure and the city last a long time, free from errors, free from, continual faults and failings. So it's important that the sector understands the opportunity that lies in front of itself to actually embrace the technology, embrace the opportunities to, integrate design, construction and in use of buildings. And that's something that happens at a very localized level in buildings in the UK, for example. But that's something that needs to be more mainstream on it from a building by building perspective, let alone on a city-wide scale. So that's a really exciting opportunity for the sector to really embrace that.
Great, thank you, Mark. And Fred, how do you see that innovation beyond the design phase? How do you see it feeding into the actual construction of this city?
Well, again, I think it's going to drive a lot of innovation from the industry. I think when you look at this, and I know people listening that might have Googled it right now, might be looking at the images or are familiar with the project, we'll be sitting there with a lot of questions because we've had some construction progress video released. Should we say that is by NEOM's promotional team? It's come from them directly. But that shows construction work starting. It shows groundwork starting. It shows a hive of activity across the construction site from basically groundworks, clearing the foundation site, loads of piling machines, piling rigs going in, and the piling work starting. And the construction site extending off into the distance. Now, we don't know how far that goes at the moment. We don't know if they're building it in phases or if they're going to build the whole thing in one go. I would imagine it's a phased build approach. But you just got to remember that you're building, to take away the fact you're building a 170 kilometer, 500 meter tall building across the desert, you're building in a desert. The temperatures are incredibly inhospitable. The working hours are tough. I know for a lot of these potentially very hot Middle East countries, they will build in the evening sometimes so that they're not just working in the middle of the day, but it's still 30, 35 degrees at night sometimes. There's the challenge of getting water resources, transporting labor to the middle of the desert. There are a lot of challenges here to make this happen. But then, we built the Burj Khalifa, we built the Golden Gate Bridge, we built the Empire State Building, we built the Channel Tunnel. These are things that people at the time thought were extraordinary challenges that just couldn't be possible. So I think this is it's an immense challenge, as I keep saying, but I think it will drive innovation. I think the construction industry is going to surprise us. I don't mind saying, being totally frank, I do personally struggle to get my head around this. When I think about One World Trade Center extending sideways for 170 kilometers, I struggle to fathom that. But then, as I said earlier, I think people before us would have struggled to fathom some of the things we see and do today. So hopefully it's a case of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, could we build something like this in the UK? I mean, the working temperatures would be a bit easier to deal with, if nothing else, but clearly there are a lot of other factors involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously first and foremost, the UK is very much, governed by a lot of legislation and a lot of demands, particularly the national planning policy, for example. So, we are a much more conservative country in relation to the design and planning process of buildings, cities, and indeed infrastructure. You've only just got to look at, the challenges we've got trying to build HS2 at the moment in terms of, the planning side of things and indeed the construction of that. But what we've got to look at, though, is the opportunities that this building can bring, or the city, can bring, and the lessons we can learn from that. Again, going back to the design stage, are there lessons that we can implement into our design, our design philosophy in the UK at a city scale, but even at a localized level in a building scale? But the challenge for us in the UK is we're very deep in regulatory compliance. You look at the Building Safety Act, the post-Grenfell challenges that the sector faces in terms of ensuring that the workforce has a level of competency, including buildings being up to standards with regards to building regulations. So there's a whole myriad of challenges that have impacted and probably held the UK back over the years in terms of architectural creativity in its buildings. You look at Spain, for example, as a country where architectural freedom is something that is quite valued in the architectural fraternity there, and the city planners are obviously very keen to ensure that their cities are resemble the past, but showcase opportunities to innovate. And I think in the UK, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from anywhere in the world, let alone building a linear city.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Fred, is there a future where you can see we could produce a more scaled back version of this in the future? Would it be more viable?
Definitely. And I think, looking at some of the lessons learned that are going to come out of the line around how do we build our cities in a sustainable way? How do we connect people with sustainable mass transit systems? How do we design 15-minute low-carbon cities that don't rely on cars but revolve around people? There's some fantastic lessons we can learn there. I think some of the innovations that Construction the Line will inevitably drive, pulling out that learning and bringing it into how we build future cities, whether they are linear cities or more conventional cities, I think is going to be incredibly important and powerful. I think, going back to the point what Mark was just talking about then, whether it's viable in the UK or could we see scale back versions of this in the future, I think it all comes back to the need, the why. Why would we do that? What do we need to be doing? What's the kind of top priority for our society? And as I said earlier, in Saudi Arabia, there is this drive at the minute to really diversify their economy and drive investment. And a project like the Line does that perfectly. It completely fits the bill. It gets you international attention, drives investment, shows your ambitions very clearly, and really sets a bar for the rest of the world to follow. It puts a landmark down on planet Earth that is very much associated with your country. Other countries aren't so much in that place, but what they are looking at doing is trying to build more low carbon societies. They're trying to cut their carbon emissions. They're trying to build in a way that creates affordable, sustainable housing for people longer term. Many cities around the world are currently grappling with the affordable housing crisis. So I think it's a question mark, about where, it's the right horse for the right course, effectively, is what I'm trying to say. You need to think about the current challenges that each individual country is facing, and then look at what is right for them in terms of urban planning and development. I think, I struggle to think of any city in the UK that has perfect urban planning, is incredibly low carbon, has affordable housing, no pollution, no congestion. I think we've got a lot to learn from this. Do we need a linear city? Probably not right now, but I think if there's learning to come out of this, then it should be welcomed. I echo what Mark said just a moment ago there about the UK's kind of building track record recently. Look at things like Crossrail, HS2, and you think, goodness me, if we're struggling with those, a linear city might be a bit of a stretch, but yeah, we'll see.
Okay, so I think we've established that this is a project that has the wow factor. The numbers are challenging to digest, if nothing else. I think we've established that with innovation, it's possible. Let's move on to the should we. If we can build this, should we build it? Fred, do you want to talk a little bit about the major sustainability implications of the Line?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are many that jump out to you because they are talking about building a low carbon city. They're talking about a place where there is sustainable mass transit. There are, I think, zero emissions, no cars anywhere. It sounds very utopian, to be quite honest. But then you look at going back to what we spoke about a moment ago, the construction challenges, the volume of concrete and steel that would be needed to construct something like that. Now, we don't know the construction materials yet, but one would assume to build something like that, of that scale, of that height, in that location, steel and concrete are going to play a role at some point. There could be sustainably sourced mass timber in there. I would hope there would be. There could be other material innovations as well. But just from a raw materials perspective, there are sustainability questions. When you then come on to the operations side, you've got to think about distribution of fresh water across a 9 million person society in the middle of the desert. The infrastructure that goes into making that happen would be enormous. It's a similar thing with power generation, power grids. It's a similar thing again with air conditioning. Is this going to be a naturally ventilated building? There are some very good natural ventilation techniques that have been used in many cities around the world, not least Barcelona, and in some of the, going right back to kind of Roman Empire designs. It's interesting looking at some of the cities at the minute that are grappling with climate change and incredibly hot weather scenarios, like Phoenix in Arizona, which are doing some really interesting things to try and cool their urban environment. But what we're talking about here is a enormous structure in the middle of the desert, which is an incredibly hot environment to start with. So, just off the top of my head there, I've come up with several questions around the sustainability implications of this. On the more positive side, what we are talking about here is an incredibly reduced amount of urban sprawl. So you've got a 9 million person city, but taking up a much, much smaller footprint on planet Earth than somewhere like London, which has also got around 9 million people altogether in the Greater London area. So there's sort of arguments both ways. I think, yes, there's the opportunity here to build a low carbon society that does have a pretty minimal impact on the environment. But I think getting there, the construction process, unless there is some kind of secret sauce they haven't told us about yet, or there's some very clever tactic, there's a lot of carbon going in here and a lot of environmental impact to make this thing a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, any view on how long it might take to offset all of the carbon that goes into the construction phase?
Yes, I've read that 1.8 billion tonnes of carbon, embodied carbon, will be produced during the design and construction phase of this. Now, offsetting that, if you compare it to the UK, whose annual carbon output is 300 million, you can see the differences in the challenges that we face. We're dealing with an unprecedented level of materials, unprecedented conditions. Building something at that scale in the, as Fred alluded to, a hospitable environment. The sanitation required, even for the construction phase of that is going to be, a challenge. So, the building itself is fraught with a number of challenges, but as we've kept referring back to, where there's a challenge, there's an opportunity. And I think for a building of this, a city on this scale, there has to be an element of innovation. There has to be a speculate to accumulate in respect of carbon emissions. However, let's not lose sight of sustainability being just about carbon. Sustainability is about, cohesive communities. And that's something that, urban sprawl has been, shown over time to really begin segregating people where, typical, again, I'll refer back to Brasilia, where you've got the favelas, which are effectively your kind of suburban districts that are, effectively, where the poorer people who work in Brasilia, live. So having a city on this scale, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is that, first of all, we're dealing with each module being 800 meters long in length. And I think the biggest fear of that is that we start compartmentalizing people into a particular district and particular job roles and particular functions. So what you might actually find is that lesser paid jobs may be in District 1, and then you go to District 2, you're in the financial district. That may attract a different type of person who wants to live and work in that particular district. So it's getting very Orwellian in terms of where, what possibilities there are here. But as I go back to the design phase and the design, we should be effectively designing that so that we, that the algorithmic outputs, replicate good sustainable practices, in terms of how communities integrate with one another. And I think cross-fertilization of cities is what makes your big cities great, where you've got a cross-fertilization of people with different cultural backgrounds, different economic, backgrounds as well. I think it's so important that, this is not just about creating a city. And I think, cities themselves and building, very large buildings and very large projects, they are symbols of economic prosperity. And I think this is an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to illustrate, yes, their economic prowess, but also an opportunity to give the wider world an opportunity to look at what the future of Saudi Arabia looks like, as a progressive, modern country. And that's something that should go hand in hand with, the line and how the line is designed, how it's built, and, obviously all the ethical considerations that come into that.
Yeah, no, I think it kind of goes to a question for me about, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Mark. Can you really custom build a city from scratch and have it be as successful as a city that's grown up over centuries, like New York, London, Barcelona, Madrid, other places like that? I think of, there's the big famous custom built capitals. There's Canberra, Brasilia, Washington, DC. There are smaller custom built cities in the UK, Milton Keynes, Welling Garden City, Letchworth Garden City. These might be names that if you're listening in the US, you never heard of before, but they are cities in the UK, I can promise you. Kind of outside of Washington, DC, which I found really compelling, I've never really found custom built cities that were sort of built in one go as appealing as somewhere that is more culturally diverse. Am I right in saying that, or is that one of the big inherent challenges here, do you think, for the line?
Yes, I mean, even close to me in Scotland, there's two modern cities in particular, or towns rather than cities, but even at the scale, they were built to support the manufacturing industries. So these modern towns were built to support local manufacturing. In Fife, they had Glenrothes, so there was coal was the local export in Fife, but you obviously had a lot of shipping and engineering works down by the harbours there. So Glenrothes, a new town, was built in that locality. Similarly, in other parts of in the west of Scotland, you've got Cumbernauld, again, to support the local engineering and manufacturing towns. Now, we know what's happened to manufacturing in the UK. So a lot of these towns were predicated on there being an economic driver. And that economic driver over the years has gradually subsided to the point where these cities are obviously not as attractive as they once were, because people are having to then travel out with that city to work. Again, Milton Keynes was probably attractive because it was quite close to London. So again, the commuting routes into London make it a commutable distance, but that's probably not what it was initially designed for. So I think the challenges we've got to look at here are we designing for the now, or are we designing for the future in mind? And at this moment in time, I don't think any of us know what the next 50 years are going to look like, in any city. But I think the point I'm trying to make, and going back to your original question, Fred, is that, communities are built up over time, and I think your progressive cities, that will embrace immigration. They'll embrace, look at cities like New York and London, the cultural diversity there leads to, over time, stronger community cohesion. And I think that's something that's really, really important with this project of this type, is that you're building something in the middle of the desert. There's no legacy of anything. Again, Brasilia tried to adopt that with Brasilia, but Brasilia was at the, at the hands of time. It was at the hands of attitudes changing. It was at the hands of, trends changing. It was at the height of, transport becoming, people owning their own cars. Yet Brasilia wasn't designed for people having their own cars. So, fads will change. And I think adaptability and versatility is so important. And that will ensure that it's much more sustainable development than something that is built, as you said, as to demonstrate their economic strength rather than a place that people want to come, work and live for future generations.
I suppose that's part of the opportunity here, because the scale is the factor. All of the examples that both of you have quoted around planned, in the UK at least, planned towns and cities, and you could go back to Saltaire or Bourneville. You can look at Poundbury as the current example. I don't know how many Poundburys would fit into the line, but it's a hell of a lot. And so the scale of being able to develop something like the line, I suppose, means that you do have the investment and the opportunity to do the mass transits, to do the city level air cooling type, these kind of initiatives. They're doable at scale, but maybe they are just one-offs, for something of that scale, because you can't necessarily scale that down. I think one of the interesting things for me from what Mark was saying was around how cities and buildings are being designed and how they could be designed in the future, because this whole concept of designing communities it's just not there in that way at the moment. Does this mean that the whole life cycle of a project has to start with a broader range of stakeholders up front? To think of the line, is there a 9 million strong client out there waiting to occupy the line? Or where are these people going to come from? And how have we factored in their needs if we don't know who they are? Sorry, that's a really long, rambly question. But Fred, do you want to have a stab at pulling something out of it?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean, Mike. I think it's one of those projects that does kind of make you sort of mince your words. And I've done it as well, where you sort of just try and fathom how this thing could work, because it is enormous. And you're right, you've got 9 million stakeholders, and I think there's an element of build it and they will come to this. I think there was that with Dubai as well. I think that we've seen it a bit in Chinese construction development in recent years, and many projects across Asia as well. And I think, the build it and they will come strategy is okay, but you've got to make a place that is appealing to 9 million people of a diverse range of ethnic, social backgrounds. And doing that is extremely difficult. I think that's the advantage that these cultural centres have, the sort of the iconic cities of the world have, and that a custom built city perhaps doesn't have to start with. I think what the line would have when it first opens is that immense appeal of saying, I live in the line, we're in the line, we're based in the line. And the investment that will drive from those who can afford it will be impressive. I think you'll see billionaires, you'll see big companies, there'll be an Apple store, I'm sure there'll be a Starbucks, the stuff that goes with any major city these days. but do you have the diversity of backgrounds? Do you have the diversity of of wealth, of labour, of cultural backgrounds to make a city truly successful? That's the question. Are there going to be affordable houses? Who's going to live in them? Where are they going to move from to get there? The list of questions goes on and on and on. I'm not saying it's a reason that it shouldn't be done. I think it underlines the challenges of what we're trying to do here. It's an immense challenge for the industry.
Yeah, and Mark, you and I have talked before about what happened during in the run up to the Qatar World Cup and the construction effort there, and the need to bring in a workforce to build 8 stadia, 9 stadia, whatever it was. Where's the workforce going to come from for this, and where are they going to go afterwards?
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest challenges that our industry is facing. It is a skill shortage in a whole host of design, construction, management professions and roles. So I think the biggest challenge is about recruiting a workforce that has the capabilities first and foremost. And we could talk about low skilled labour, and low skilled labour is low skilled labour. It tends to be exploited, and it tends to get that negative connotation attached to it. For it's an opportunity to bring in labour at a low cost, and the malpractice that we can look at in terms of how migrant workers in particular were treated during the Qatar World Cup. The danger is we're replicating that on a city scale, as opposed to obviously a series of stadiums and infrastructure. So I think the biggest challenge we have is again we could look at. I remember in the 1990s, my dad and my dad's friends and so forth were attracted to build Dubai. They were attracting electricians, they were attracting people with the requisite qualifications from the UK to go out and build Dubai. And this will be no different, but there comes a point where, do you have, the requisite level of qualifications and experience to deliver on this? And if we look at, some of the items that we're facing in the UK, for instance, post-Grenfell, there is a big push on competency, ensuring people have the requisite levels of qualifications to do a particular operation on site or off site. And my fear is that we lose that because the demand is on about building and getting this built, get this city built, as opposed to let's build it right first time. Let's, have good quality. Let's have, a good ethos in terms of how our workers are recruited, how they're treated, and indeed what happens to them at the end of a project or a phase of the project. I think that's the biggest challenge, and that's the biggest uncertainty for me, is that where will these people come from? Now, we can look at an opportunity to automate construction processes. We could look at an opportunity to reduce the amount of site labour. But, we're struggling to build buildings with automation in mind, let alone a whole entire city. So there's big challenges and big questions and big reservations, I think, that I have in terms of having the requisite levels of skills and the suitable skill sets to deliver this project. And that goes, right back to the planning stage, as opposed to, think about things from a buildability perspective. So a lot of questions remain unanswered about that. But going back to the points we've been making about taking this compartment by compartment, as opposed to thinking about this as a 127 kilometre city, actually break it down into its first module. How do we build that first 800 metres? And that's for me is the sequential process, because time will change, processes will evolve, people will evolve, materials will evolve. And we may even get to a point where each module is representative of a particular period. A 10-year period. We have the 2020s module 1. We have the 2030s module 2. And that chronology may actually be a success that illustrates, for generations, how our construction and engineering processes have evolved from module 1 to module, 100 or whatnot, So I think that's an exciting thing for me. If I was a kid and if I was a younger person, looking back at that, I'd see this as a great way to kind of basically show how the industry has evolved over the stretch of 127 miles.
Yeah. So that sounds amazing. If we could, as an architecture and construction geek, to walk through the line and get that kind of history of evolution from one end to the other would be absolutely incredible. I was listening to you talk, Mark, and I wonder if the skilled labour challenge is actually going to be more pronounced outside of Saudi Arabia because of the amount of resources that Saudi Arabia basically is going to draw in. We've seen already there's money to be made. There are big name architects, ADAS, Zaha Hadid Architects, Foster and Partners, ACOM. Some of the big consultancy practices are already heavily engaged in Saudi Arabia and the NEOM project. They are spending the money. They're attracting the biggest and best talent out there. I think the line, I have to say as a side point, is a really good thing for encouraging more people to take a look at this industry, particularly in the context of the skills crisis, to get young people excited about what's possible, about what we can build, about how to shape the world. I think it's done a fantastic job of putting construction and architecture on the front page of newspapers worldwide and getting people talking about this industry. And it is going to draw in more talent. I would hope it draws in more talent as the construction works progress. But I wonder if it's going to be more of an issue, as I said, outside of Saudi Arabia because of the amount of people, talent, resources that are going to be drawn in to this immense project that is being prioritized, that is being invested in to an extent that you wouldn't see these kind of construction fees or consultancy fees paid elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think one one opportunity that we have is, I remember being on a course down in London a few years back, and there were graduate apprentices who worked for one of the large consultants that you mentioned, Fred. But part of their apprenticeship was a global apprenticeship where they got to go to the Middle East, they got to go to Australasia, they got to go to the United States. And I think, your large organizations will be able to attract a talent pool and retain them through, just by virtue of giving them exposure to the global marketplace. And I think there's a lesson to be learnt there in terms of what are we doing to support our young people post-qualification. I think that's one of the biggest challenges any business has is once you have, an apprentice, let's say, through their qualification, they're looking for that next step. They may be looking for that next, financial increment on their salary that they may get, a practice across the road. So the retention of staff post-apprenticeship across trades and construction professions is a challenge. It's a major challenge. And as you said, Fred, the opportunities to be drawn to this development, for the financial, let alone the weather, there's an opportunity there for us, in the UK as businesses to actually think about how can we get on the supply chain of this project so that we could, retain our staff, but actually give them the opportunity and the experiences they want. Because, younger people in particular these days are very much, their approach to life is completely different from when, going back, when I graduated in 2002, it was very much about getting to employment and get on the ladder. I think there's a different approach now where people are much more concerned about things like work-life balance and about, their general happiness. And I think the opportunity to, perhaps engage in a skills and training system that gives people the opportunities to travel, but to learn while you, instead of learning while you, earn, actually earn while you, travel, so I think there's opportunities there that, obviously it's much easier for a larger, tier one, to engage with that. But, the alternative to that is, as you said, Fred, we lose skills from the UK, in particular. We as a country, we have a very respected education system globally. And with that, there comes an element of, credibility if you have a UK, degree qualification, for example. So that makes, our graduates very, very attractive, but that leaves us in a predicament if we have we've already got a skills shortage without contributing to that through the financial and the lucrative financial rewards of potentially being based in a project in the Middle East for however long,
Thank you, Mark. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to draw this fascinating conversation to a close. We're running out of time for today, but I think it's one we may choose to revisit in the future. I think certainly there's follow up on the line specifically, but a lot of the topics that we've covered today. It just remains for me to thank you both for what certainly for me has been a fascinating conversation today. Fred Mills, Marc Fleming, thank you both so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation. Really interested to hear what you've had to say. That's it for this episode of Be Sustainable. I think it's likely that we'll come back to this topic, and hopefully Fred and Marc will be available to join us again in the future. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you, Fred. Thank you.